Our first page for today's lesson is on tenths, decimals, and percents. Our first question asks us to shade the percent. So, if this is divided into 10 pieces, and together it's 100%, each block would be 10%. So to shade 50%, I would need to shade 5 squares. So I can go through and shade in 5. So you do the same thing for B with 30%. For question number 2, they're asking us what percent of the dots are white. So if we count these dots here, we can count up in how many dots are white. 7 dots are white, which means what percentage of the dots are white? 70% of the dots are white. Then you would do the opposite for gray. For question 3, they're asking us to shade 80% of the dots. So we're looking at these dots over here. If they ask me to shade 80%, how many dots do I need to shade? I would need to shade 8 dots. So I can just come in and shade in those 8 dots. Then in question B, they'll ask us what percent of the dots are not shaded. So if we look at the white dots, that is 20%. So make sure if they haven't given you the percent sign, you need to include it in your answer. Question 4 doesn't show us the marbles, but it asks us a question about them. So if 10% of 100 marbles are blue, how many of the marbles are not blue? There would be 90% that are not blue because 10% would be 10 marbles out of 100. So 100 minus 10 is 90. Question 5 asks us to write the percent as a fraction and then as a decimal. So if I'm looking at 90%, to write it as a fraction out of 100, it would be 90 out of 100. To turn that into a decimal, it would be 0.90. And this is using the same techniques we've used before. Now, for question 6, they just ask us to go straight from writing the percent as a decimal. So, if we looked at question 5, we might notice that our decimals, like here in the percent, and when we go to our decimal, it's moved back 2 spaces because it's being divided by 100. So, if we had 25%, what would that be as a decimal? 0.25. And so you'll need to remember if there's only one place, you'll have to maybe have a 0 as a placeholder, right? 5% wouldn't be 0.5, it would be 0.05. Question 7 requires us to do a couple of steps. So we're starting with 0.2, and the 2's in the tenths place. So we write that as 2/10. What would this become out of 100? It would be 20 out of 100. Then to turn this into a percent, it would be 20%. So we have to go directly from our numerator that's over 100. We can't just go from tenths straight to the percentage. Question 8 asks us to write the decimal as a percent by moving the decimal point 2 places to the right. So if I move it over 2 places, 0.4 is, so it would be 40% because we had to move it over 2 places, which means we fill in that extra space with a 0. Carson?
It would be 38.
Right. 3/8, which would then give us 38%. Okay? Our last question is a word problem. It says Kay bought 6 jazz CDs and 4 rock CDs. What fraction of the CDs are jazz and what percent are total? So some key things to pay attention to are, the first one asks you for the fraction of jazz. So this will be a part out of a whole. It will be jazz out of the total number of CDs. Whereas the second part asks you to find a percent of rock. So once you find rock out of the total, then you can turn this into a percentage once you make it into a fraction out of 100. So our next lesson is on fractions and percents. So writing the fraction as a percent means that we need to change it to a fraction over 100. So it's not just any decimal fraction, but it has to be out of 100. This is why when we started with 3/5, we had to multiply it by 20 to become a fraction out of 100, which gives us 60%. So if we were to look at 3 out of 20, what would we need to multiply it by to become a number out of 100? We'd have to multiply it by 5 out of 5, and that would give us 15 out of 100, which equals what percent? 15, because we just take our numerator and it becomes our percentage. Question 2 gives us a word problem. They say that 2 out of 5 friends, or 2/5, ordered pizza. What percent ordered pizza? So, what is our first step? We need to write an equivalent fraction out of 100. In order to do this, I need to multiply by 20. And so that gives me a numerator of 2 times 20, which is 40. So this tells me that the percent that ordered pizza is 40%. Remember to include your percent sign. For question number 3, they ask us to change the fraction, but first we need to reduce it if necessary. So when we looked at 9 out of 15, we can't multiply 15 by a whole number and get 100. So instead, they divided it by 3 first to get 3 out of 5, and then they multiplied it by 20 to get something out of 100. So if we were to look at B, 3 and 15 can be simplified to 1 out of 5 by dividing by 3. Then we can make it into 20 out of 100 because we know that we need to multiply 5 by 20 in order to get there. This gives us 20%. So we have 2 steps. First, we need to make it smaller, and then we bring it up to 100. If we look at C, where we have 9 out of 18, what number can we divide both of those by? We can divide them both by 9. So that will give me 9 divided by 9 is 1, and 18 divided by 9 is 2. Now I need to get to 100. So 2 times what gives me 100? Times 50. So I'll do the same thing to the top. So 1 times 50 is 50, and this gives me 50%. Question 4 gives us a different strategy, and this is the one that you will use most often in life, and it's to divide to change the fraction to a decimal and then write the decimal as a percent. So if I have 3 out of 4, we already know from our previous lessons that we can divide the top number by the bottom number to get our decimal. So 3 divided by 4 is, so if you put it into your calculator, you get 0.75, and then we turn our decimal to a percent. So to do that, we move the decimal over 2 places, and so this would give us 75%. Question 5 asks us to write the percent as a decimal, then as a fraction, and then in lowest term. So we're going to break this into 1, 2, 3 steps. So our first step is to write it as a decimal. So if I have 40% as a decimal, this would be 0.40 because I'm just moving the decimal back 2 places. My second step is to write this as a fraction. So 0.40 as a fraction is, so this would give me 40 out of 100 because there's 2 places after the decimal, and my numerator becomes the top number. Now for my third step, I need to reduce this to lowest terms, which means I can't divide the top and bottom by anything else. So what can I divide 40 and 100 by? I could divide them both by 20, which would give me, so if we divide it by 20, that gives us 2/5, and we can't divide 2 and 5 by anything other than 1. So this is our final answer. So if I were to look at this with 75, and I'm going to change up my colors a little bit, 75% as a decimal is, it's 0.75. Then I'm going to switch up to black for number 2. To turn it into a fraction, 0.75 out of 100 would be 75 out of 100. Then I need to think of what can I divide 75 and 100 by. I could divide both of these by 25 cents, or 25, because I can think of quarters, and that gives me 75 divided by 25 is 3, and 100 divided by 25 is 4. I can't divide 3 and 4 by anything other than 1, so we have made it to our final answer. Question 6 asks if the fraction is closest to 10%, 25%, 50%, 75%, or 100%. So we can look at what things are about. So 4/5 is about what percent? This is like 0.8, so that would be the same as 80%. If I look at 80% in this list, it's closest to 75%. So that would be my final answer. If I look at B, 2 out of 10 is about, it's 20%. So then if I look at my list, it's closest to 25%. Now question 7 has us starting with estimating what percent the fraction is. And say what fraction you use to make your estimate. Then they're getting you to divide to change the fraction to a decimal. So I'm going to walk you through the first one. 11 out of 40. To me, that looks pretty close to 10 out of 40, which is 1/4, which I know is 25%. So this is my estimate. It's my guess where I use a number that's close. Then to do the actual solving in my calculator, I would divide and go 11 divided by 40. I'm using the real numbers here. As a decimal, that would give me 0.275. And if I turned that into a percent, it would be, so if we took our decimal and moved it over 2 places to get our percent, it would be 27.5%. And that's pretty close to 25. That seems like a reasonable estimate. So remember, there's 2 steps. One where you find a fraction that's close and easy to turn into a percent. That's what I did in red. And one in blue where you do the actual work of dividing with your calculator to turn it into a percent. The last question on this page is number 8. They ask you to write the fraction as a decimal. So this is our step 1. Then you need to round to 2 decimal places. And then you are writing the approximate percent. So there's 3 steps. The first one, writing it as a decimal, we can use our calculator. So if we had 5/12, we put into our calculator 5 divided by 12, which gives us 0.416 with the 6 repeating. Then our second step would be to round it. So you notice that's why they have the about sign instead of the equals. So the 6 tells us that we are rounding up. And then to turn this into a percent, it would be about 42% because we're going to move the decimal over 2 places. So we won't get an exact number. We're getting something that is around the same number though. For 8b below here, so if I had 1/3 I need to figure out the decimal. So in my calculator, I'll do 1 divided by 3, which gives me 0.3 repeating. Now, I need to round this to 2 decimal places. And in order to do that, I need to open up and move this over a little bit. So each of these would be a 3 coming after it. So the 3 here tells me that I would round down to 0.33, and then this as a percent would give me 33%. Okay? So you have to break it down into each of those steps, but if it's repeating, remember that it's not a 0 coming after it, it's that digit repeating.